So welcome everybody to our next session of Plex, people with lived experiences, patients with lived experiences. My name is Joe Pantginis. I'm the head of research and managing director at HC Wainwright. From a disclosure standpoint, I cover lineage cell therapeutics with a buy rating. Just wanted to give a little bit of my takeaways from yesterday and where I think this is a fantastic place to start with the patients and their caregivers as well, in that I think PFDD is an absolutely fantastic idea, and I'm looking to turn those wonderful slides that you showed earlier in turning it from potential energy to kinetic energy, because there's a lot of great ideas and how do we bring it all together. And with the multiple takeaways I had yesterday, I think one of the key things is, and I had some of the discussions in the after hours talks with people at the bar, restaurant, what have you, is how do we turn this into even a U.S. version of what Praxis is doing yesterday? I think that was very compelling about what they presented on all the interactions that they're engaging with and with every single stakeholder that's out there. So I think I'm really going to pose that question not only to our distinguished panel, but also the additional panels later, the surgical approaches, the different clinical company approaches as well. So if you're in the audience, please think about that question because I'm going to ask it. So again, thank you for being here. I'm hoping maybe, since we'll start with the closest, maybe you could just give a little brief introduction to yourself so people know who you are.
Okay. No, I'm quite loud. So my name is Hanna. Is it on? Okay. I am Jerod Nieder's wife, and I'm also his full-time caregiver. I also work full-time, and I met Jerod and was introduced to the world of spinal cord injury 6 years ago? Yeah. 6 years ago now, and just have immersed myself along with Jerod.
My name's Jerod Nieder. I was injured December 18th, 2011, and that's what sent me down this journey. I did my original inpatient at Craig, and I've participated in research for the last almost 10 years, and I just think we're at a really cool point where it's time for a maturation and an evolution of what we're doing. And it's not that we haven't done good enough in the past, it's that we can do that much better in the future. And I think we're really excited about where things are going.
My name is Michaela Devins. I had my injury July 4th, 2010. So that's also what set me down this path. I started out at Shepherd Center in Atlanta once upon a time, and have been kind of all over the place. Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Good Shepherd in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and now I do a lot of outpatient therapy at Spalding in Boston, where we currently live, being from the East Coast. I also have gone back to school in that time and got my master's in professional mental health counseling. So that's what I do professionally, although I've taken some time off in the last year. And yeah, I'm really excited about, hearing yesterday about really putting people with lived experience at the center, which I think is something that has been sorely missing from spinal cord injury research and rehabilitation. So just really looking forward to what the future holds.
I'm Kyle Devins. I'm Michaela's husband. We've been together since before Michaela's injury. We started dating in high school, so it's been a while, since 2006. I also work full-time. I'm also a physician, although I don't do anything related to spinal cord injury. I'm a pathologist. And Michaela's full-time caregiver as well. So yeah, I think similar to what others were saying, I was encouraged yesterday. I think some of the things you'll be hearing from us will echo some of the points that were made yesterday about endpoints that are valuable to people with lived experience as well as their caregivers. Yeah.
Thanks for the introduction. And you know what? I'm gonna go with the common theme that's on stage right now, but is not necessarily a theme that's found in the broader patient population. On stage right now is you have your spouses as your direct caregivers. That's not really necessarily all the time true. You have different types of caregivers, also the different levels of family support that's out there or not. So maybe you can start with maybe some of your thoughts on how lucky you are, number one, to have your spouses as your caregivers and how that impacts your life in general versus maybe other patients you might have talked to where they don't necessarily have that advantage?
For sure. Before Hanna was my caregiver, like, research was a huge challenge. Caregivers, it's tough when they come in every day. They, nobody is 100% at showing up to work. Nobody is 100% at being on time. And caregivers, it's extremely challenging. And then when you shift to having your wife who lives with you and is with you all the time and knows you so well, it is a challenge for the relationship, but it's a huge advantage for my life to be able to have my wife who's in bed next to me. I know she's going to get me up in the morning, because if she doesn't get up, I just say, hey, get up, So it's a huge benefit.
Yeah, I can speak to that as well. It is such a challenge in the landscape of the U.S. to get caregivers, because it's different depending on the state, depending on Medicaid or Medicare programs. When he was looking into residency, we had to completely cross certain states off our list because they had a cap of 20 hours of care a week. Well, guess what? If he's at work for 60, 70 hours a week, that's 40 hours that I don't have help. So, there are certain states that we just couldn't even consider. And then you take into account that some states have a consumer-directed program, while others have, more of an agency-directed program. And there are pros and cons to both, but the common theme is that, home health aides are chronically underpaid, they're chronically undertrained, right? So, like you said, like some people, no one's 100% at showing up to work, but in Massachusetts, which is consumer directed, where I'm required to find people, hire them, train them, schedule them, and also potentially fire them. If someone doesn't show up, well, I'm just out of luck, right? So to have my spouse as my caregiver, again, is a huge help. And for folks, I know folks that have had to spend the night in their chair multiple nights in a row because they don't have help, or they end up in bed and they can't get out of bed because someone didn't show up for work that day, and they don't have the support system that I am very blessed to have, right? So it is a huge challenge. And when you're looking at that in regards to like getting people engaged in research, like if you think about not knowing if someone's going to show up to help you get dressed and get where you need to be that day, well, that's a huge barrier.
Yeah, and getting approved for hours is really hard. And what I had to do in Kansas, to be honest, was they paid the caregivers so low is that I had to leave the caregiver checked in for twice the hours that they were actually there for, so I could pay them more. So it was worth it for them to come to work. So then you're actually dealing with half the hours that you get approved for, and you didn't get approved for the amount of hours that you need. Mm-hmm. And these are the challenges that everybody in the community is dealing with.
Yes. And a lot of times, if you are a spouse, you're an unpaid caregiver. It's state specific, but so in Kentucky specifically, if you're a spouse, you're just expected to be able to manage the care, also work full time. If you have children, I don't even understand that, how you manage life. But one of the other challenges with agency funded caregiving is, so again, state specific, but in Kentucky, the person provided by the agency cannot administer medication. So they cannot, use a suppository, which is one of the main functions that we needed a caregiver for.
Yeah.
So when I was traveling to go out of town for a bachelorette party, I was trying to figure out how we would get a caregiver, and so we called around to the agencies, and they suggested that we not only have a person from the agency, but also a registered nurse. I don't know that it's on. Oh, there you go. A registered nurse come along with that person. So we're paying 2 people for a bowel program. And the nurse is paid, I think, $40 an hour, and then the agency is paid, whatever the insurance company will provide, or the waiver from the state will provide. So those are extra challenges, and I'm just thinking, like, I could probably count on my one hand how many trips I've taken solo, because I'm taking on the cost of not only myself to go on a trip, but essentially, like, double that to provide care at home, and it's privately paid. So,
And not just the cost, the hassle. And it's
Yeah.
like everything with SCI is such a hassle that it really kind of beats you down.
Yeah, and it is really hard to find reliable people. And I found that especially difficult when I was going to grad school and like trying to work afterward, is that in order for me to be at work on time and do my job and my duty to my clients, I have to rely on someone else being to me on time and helping me get to where I need to go. So that was incredibly frustrating. And we have found all kinds of ways around it, just because it is such a hassle to navigate. Not to mention the fact that because folks are underpaid, you're not necessarily always getting the best people for the job or people that are really in it for, purely altruistic reasons. I've been stolen from. I've had people just not show up. I've been lied to, and it really, on a psychological level as well, it's like, it's very, it's difficult to cope with that day in and day out. So, yeah.
Before Hanna, managing my own care, I had to maintain a staff of at least 7 people to make sure that if something went wrong, that somebody could cover. And as a quadriplegic, just trying to figure things out, like that's running your own business, and that's really difficult.
Yeah, I think, I guess 2 things. One, on the subject of how difficult it is to plan for other things, I think you stayed with your mom briefly a couple weeks ago, and we were thinking back to the last time you had someone else help you get into bed and get up in the morning besides me, and it had been a very, very long time, years and years, and then before that, another period of years and years before the last one. So it's difficult. I think also the supports that we're talking about, the state provided caregivers, which you've already heard about some of the difficulties with that, but there's also oftentimes for the state to help at all, there's usually a income requirement that you have to fall under, and it's usually pretty low. So oftentimes people are stuck in a situation where I want to work, but if I work, I'm going to make too much money, and I'm going to suddenly receive no help paying for my caregivers anymore. So functionally, I would be in worse financial shape.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult situation that people are put in, and it's very difficult without family member help.
and
I think
just
sorry,
no,
go ahead.
you can go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, I think it's also surprising to people that are in the world of disability and spinal cord injury that we want to work. We have goals, we have,
Hire us, yeah.
aspirations, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but it is to a lot of people.
But that is a big barrier, and I think a lot of times, if you think about it, how expensive it is to hire caregivers, and then the income cap that's applied, and a lot of times in many states, you cannot have more than $2,000 in your bank account at any
Yes.
time. That's all you can have to your name, and if you have more than that, at any given moment, every assistance program that you have applied for and fought for could be taken away from you. And so if you think about it, you're having to pay these caregivers more, oftentimes by hours alone, which is cutting into the hours that you have assistance at home, or you could privately pay additional, you're getting paid by the agency this amount, and I'll pay you this amount on top of that. So I know a lot of friends that do this as well.
Which is explicitly against the rules, and you'll get kicked out of the program if they find out.
Right, but how are you supposed to hire good help? And so we've actually helped some of our friends hire caregivers, and the best way to do that is, go to the dean of a nursing school, ask them to put out a flyer, because it's good experience. Hire the techs that may be looking for extra work. Care.com, and then Craigslist. Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
It's just about finding people that are willing to learn, and then it's not pretty doing a BOW program, and it's not really something that a lot of people want to sign up for, but it's necessary every single day.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say about the $2,000 cap that is particularly messed up, for lack of a better phrase, is that disability is expensive, right? So if you come across any potential emergency situation, whether it's your van broke down or you've been hospitalized, or right, any number of things, you don't have a cushion for helping you deal with that. And then you're left to rely on family, community, friends. I mean, any way that you can.
As much as I hate it, Hannah and I didn't legally get married to avoid a lot of these issues, and I hate that. I really hate that, but it's...
And I think a lot of times after injury, if you're together and already married, a lot of people consider divorce, just on paper, because otherwise they can't make it work. Mm-hmm. You could pay for the first year and be in debt, and then what? And then try to get divorced, and then have, like I said, it's just a really expensive life, and it's something that causes a lot of stress, and I feel like everything's a battle, and as positive as you want to be about things, nothing is made for a wheelchair user, and I think we always try to advocate for universal design, but no matter what, like flying here, it's like I am an employee of Delta, essentially. So we do everything that we can possibly do to prep his wheelchair. We have signage, it literally says, like, please take care, these are my legs, and this is my phone number. If you have any questions, there's a diagram of his chair with, like, color-coordinated things of, like, this is how you lock it, please lock it. This is where you lift, please lift from here. So it's just everything really is a battle, and it's just great to have an audience who may be interested in what our day-to-day life looks like and understand why it's so important to further the clinical developments and clinical trials. And we always try to say, like, I think, come from a very pure standpoint, because we don't care who finishes first. We want somebody to get to the finish line, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to help every single organization do better and improve their processes and improve whatever it is, and whatever input we can provide, we're willing to provide it, just because we want to get to the finish line.
Yeah, we say we're Team SCI. There's all these different factions across all these organizations, but what we're for is SCI, what's good for SCI as a whole. And that's, I think, what this room is all about, and that's what's so cool.
So what I hear, number one, it's an issue because, here we are trying to talk about PFDD, but at the same time, is everyone truly getting a grasp of, like, the day-to-day issues that you face, whether it's damage to a wheelchair or, any logistics that you have to throw in place? In fact, I would add, Marco, for example, the slide that you had up there, an additional box that says patient logistics, on the day-to-day issues, because now, when do you find time, which we'll talk about a bit now, your input into drug development and clinical trials, and now how do you decide? There's a whole continuum of time here. 10 years plus ago when you were injured, the initial questions of, you weren't thinking about how you were going to do the day-to-day activities. You were thinking about what was your initial treatment plan. And then as things move forward and you'd be like, okay, how am I going to pay for this? How am I going to do that? How am I going to deal with my next treatment plan? And your treatment plans today, while you're dealing with all of these issues on the day-to-day issue with insurance or caregivers or what have you. So how do you even think about your treatment plan while you're dealing with all those other issues?
Yeah. I think in the beginning, truly, it's just survival.
Yeah.
You are literally hour to hour, day to day. As far as me and my family were concerned, we weren't thinking about really anything beyond surviving the next day. Because your entire life is completely pulled out from underneath you. And not only, in a physical and a medical sense, but emotionally, psychologically, you don't even know which way is up. There is an immense amount of trauma and grief that accompanies having an injury like this. And so the mental and emotional toll, I always say that the person with the injury is the epicenter of that. But it ripples out to family and friends in a huge way. And something I've noticed, and maybe it's my background in mental health, but there is such a lack of mental health care in the initial intervening period after an injury. And as big as that initial trauma is, unfortunately, hospital systems and research systems can add to that trauma in huge ways. And so for me, I think about how can we inform doctors, clinicians, researchers about approaching people who have been through absolute hell, to be honest, in a trauma-informed way. I think that's like, apart from all the logistics, that's like step number one for me, because I have been, considered for research candidacy for certain things where I decided not to go because my experiences during that time were incredibly re-traumatizing. So that's a barrier.
It's so interesting also how, when you meet new people, it could be just on a sidewalk and you're passing them briefly, but they want to say hello to you sometimes. And then the number one question that comes up is, how are you injured? Which is like, you want to ask this stranger about the most traumatic day of his life. And so it's like really intimate, but at the same time, I think we've grown accustomed to it. So it's not as, it doesn't matter. Jerod, I don't think minds the question at all, but I just thought that was very interesting. And it's just a pure question, which is, okay. But I think there is like a fear of how to speak to individuals, with a disability. And you kind of just want to be, they're kind-hearted, but it's also just interesting to see.
I mean, that really, it is just putting the disability first. I do kind of cringe at that question because it's like, all right, well, yeah, let's talk about this. Like, let's talk about me. Let's talk about sports.
Yeah.
Talk about the weather. Like, do we have to talk about the chair all the time?
Yeah. I think that you're very kind saying it comes from a good place. I think people are morbidly curious, to be honest.
Yeah.
And they also feel entitled to your story.
Yeah.
I have found that in a lot of ways. I'll sometimes refuse. I'll be like, someone will ask me, oh, what happened to you? And I'll say, oh, that's interesting. Why do you want to know? And they get really mad at me. And I'm like, well, maybe that's something you should think about. Like, why do you feel like this is something you need to know?
Yeah, it is. They just feel entitled to it. And like the comparison I make often is, a lot of people are overweight or something. So could I turn around and be like, I mean, what do you eat to weigh that?
Right.
This is taking a turn.
No, that's okay. It's still very valuable. So I want to hang on one of your comments, Michaela, about, you were considered to be a participant in a particular research plan and you turned it down. And one of the things that I hooked on to also when we talked previously was, well, first, maybe some generalities. You could be as specific as you want about, why did you turn it down? Because everyone would be like, oh, is there a promise or what have you? What makes you choose a particular research program or clinical program? And then the thing that I was alluding to was signing the informed consent form. That really struck me hardly, strongly, in the sense that even though you're signing informed consent, a lot of our discussions were you don't necessarily know what you're getting into or that it's explained to you.
100%. There were a number of incidences throughout that whole week that really sort of culminated in me saying, this is not right for me. The first incident was they were going to do a test on the bladder urinalysis that required me to be undressed from the waist down. And as we're preparing for this, a whole group of people file into the room. And I am like, who are these people? They're like, oh, they're here to observe. I said, no one said anything about this to me. No one asked me if that was okay. Give me a good reason why they should be here and I might consider it. But you've totally bypassed me in this whole process. And they said, oh, well, it's important for them, yada, yada. I said, no, please ask them to leave. I'm not. And at that point, this is maybe 10 years after my injury, I am experienced enough at advocating for myself that I feel free to use my voice and to say, no, absolutely not. I know what I'm willing to put up with and what I'm not, and this is not one of them. And that was something that was re-traumatizing because initially after my injury, I was trached and ventilated and I could not speak. And during that time, people would just do things or talk about me as if I did not understand everything that was happening. And I couldn't say anything, right? And so it felt like my voice and my agency had been completely stripped. And so to be back in a hospital setting and back in a situation where they're bypassing your voice is like, it's incredibly demeaning.
Yeah, I think adding to that, something that we encounter on the street fairly frequently is, which ties into this eventually, but if both of us walk up to a counter to order coffee or something, inevitably the barista or someone will turn to me and say, "What does she want?" or something. Which I think is like a natural response for people because they're not used to people with physical disabilities, being out and about and being mentally.
Or they feel awkward, but it's not an excuse.
Right, but sometimes that same kind of thing happens in a medical setting where we think that we should know better, and I think it's more painful when it happens in that setting because you feel like you're in a space where you should be heard and understood a little bit better.
And the body remembers, right? That's what we know about trauma. The body remembers. And so being in that environment again and having that happen again, it was just like, and I think it was partially healing for me to be able to use my voice, 10 years later and say, no, I'm not doing this, right? But it's just, I think it speaks to the fact that we need clinicians and researchers and all of our, folks that we want to get to the finish line with. We need them to consider what trauma-informed care looks like and the very real human emotional impact that the work that you do has.
So you just said something very powerful in that you found your voice and you were able to do that physically and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, how does that strike the balance? Again, being very fortunate, both of you, to have your spouses and your partners as your caregivers. Obviously, a caregiver you hire for 20 hours a week is not necessarily going to speak up for you, but how do you strike the balance of, say, Kyle wanting to speak up, but knowing you have a voice, and, where does the balance?
I think it kind of comes from feel, and I mean, we've been together for a really long time, so if I can tell that Michaela's upset and has not said anything yet, then I'll usually say something to at least prompt her to have the ability to say this is fine or this isn't fine. Mm-hmm. But I try not to speak for her.
That's one thing I love about Hanna is this injury beats you down, and there's some battles that I just kind of I give up or I kind of lose the fervor for it. And Hanna is my biggest advocate, and I love that. There's things that I would let things that aren't okay happen, and Hanna's like, no. And yeah, she knows that she has that place with me and she can do what she wants at any time, but to have that advocate with me at all times is huge.
Well, and I think Jerod has quite the voice, so it's not needed as often. But one particular moment does stick out to me, and I kind of see life as black and white. My friends call me Disney princess because there's right and there's wrong in my brain. But we were on our honeymoon. We were flying Spirit to get to Hawaii, so it was our first flight out. And I, got held up. I was waiting by the chair because I don't let this chair leave and get on the plane until I've spoken to the grounds crew. That's rule number 1. You have to speak to the individual that's going to be taking the chair away. Otherwise, likely it's going to be broken. And that's a big fear is going to vacation. It's okay going back home, but when you're going to a vacation, that's an ultimate fear. So I was out, and Jerod was being transferred with the aisle chair into our seats. And it took quite a while for me to actually get on the plane. But when I got on the plane, I could tell something was wrong. Everybody was kind of looking at me. There was looks of shock on people's faces. And then Jerod just sitting there beaming at me, just super happy. And I'm what's happening? And then the person behind us actually spoke up and was the way that they treated him was unacceptable. And I just remember, because Jerod was just trying not to ruin the mood. But the flight attendant came up to me, and she was well, he couldn't open this door, so we had to put him in this seat. And Jared's knees were touching the seat in front of us. I was well, this is a very long flight, so this isn't going to work for us. He's going to have AD all the way there. He already sweats when we fly. Flying's very hard. I don't know, I'm getting so emotional. Anyway, so essentially everybody on the plane wanted to help transfer him once we got up into the air. They had an aisle chair on board, which doesn't always happen. But there are plenty of seats available that he could have been put in, but Jerod just didn't want to speak up and advocate for himself because he just didn't want to ruin the mood for a honeymoon. So I just think about that sometimes, and it's like, I don't care. Like, this means more to me than, like, being happy on our flight. So, but there's always good people around, and I don't even know what the point of that story was. But I think what the point is, like, nobody wanted to speak up or nobody knew how to help until, like, they saw that I was with him, and then it became more of an issue. And then it became, like, where the flight attendants were kind of, I gave them a little bit of, my voice. And I explained why we had the seats that we had and why this seat wouldn't work for us. And his knees were already scraped up, like I could see it, and I pointed it out. And, on takeoff, you could see them whispering to each other. And then they came up to me, specifically me, and they were like, okay, we can move him to the seat that's available. But I was like, why couldn't you listen to him initially when he was telling you that? Why does it have to come from me? So that's kind of the frustrating part about it.
That's an unfortunate reality, I think,
Yeah.
is that people are way more willing to listen to our able-bodied spouses than they are willing to listen to us.
I have an uncle with severe cognitive disabilities, and it really kind of hurts my heart because I see myself getting treated the same way I saw him get treated a lot of times. We would have to go to his doctor's appointments and advocate for him, and a lot of times the professionals would look at my uncle and be like, kind of whatever. And now I feel that a lot of times, and that's a crummy feeling.
Yeah.
Having to explain your worth to professionals.
Yeah, I think in the medical setting also, there's definitely been times where I usually work in the hospital system that you are getting care from, and when people know that and know that I'm around, they sort of are like, oh, we better really listen to this person and really be on top of her because her husband is like, in our system. But I often wonder what happens to the people who don't have that or don't have any advocate with them at all.
We know what happens, right?
They fall through the cracks.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me so angry that I can tell there's a palpable difference in the way that I'm treated before they find out my husband is a physician and after they find out.
Yeah,
And
black
it
and
makes
white.
me incredibly mad.
This is all extremely helpful. I mean, number one, it talks to the humanity of people out there, so that's always good to hear, and I'd like to think that's the majority of people, to be able to act like that on your flight and what have you. So not to take a complete left turn, because I think it does flow, in the sense that, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about not only research, but things that are important to you from a research standpoint and what have you. So I mentioned humanity, very good, the emotional standpoint. Not anyone in this room, because they all get it, but if you're gonna go down across the street and talk to people down at the mall or what have you, and be like, oh, what do you think SCI research is for? What do you think is gonna happen? Even from the days when Christopher Reeve had an injury, it's all about, say it. Okay, they're going to get up and walk again. You're going to do whatever. And, there's going to be massive recovery because of all these technological advances. Now, we know that's not the case right now. But, let's start maybe with Michaela and Kyle. It's like, what do you feel are, some of the real important things that you would like to get from research? Obviously, you talked about how you got there, some of the issues with informed consent, but, maybe some of the things that would be important to you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think would save us so much time and grief, honestly, is like having real change in regard to like bowel and bladder care. And something I think of a lot, specifically with bladder care, is that, most of the time, I think, we manage a neurogenic bladder with indwelling catheter or intermittent catheterization, right? And like, I've seen folks 20, 30 years down the line who have like bladder cancer because of some of the things that are in catheters, like the materials they're made out of, as well as like bladder spasticity, like something that, yesterday was really interesting to me, was like talking about something beyond just Botox for the bladder that could help manage bladder spasticity, as well as like chronic UTI is a really huge issue in our community. And something, research that could look into like something that could help us with that, right? Because if you have UTI over and over again because you have indwelling catheters, or you're, introducing, a foreign object to your bladder system all the time, and then you're taking antibiotics and you're becoming antibiotic resistant. And, for me, I guess for any quad, right, who deals with autonomic dysreflexia, usually it's the bladder or the bowel that causes it. Those are the two most common reasons. So to me, autonomic dysreflexia is the scariest thing about SCI. It terrifies me. So if we have something that can help with bladder and bowel care in that way, there's so many facets to it that I think I would love to see real progress on that personally. As well as like if you're managing, involuntary accidents, it takes so much time out of your day to get into bed and get cleaned up and get dressed and get back up again. And, I think it would save both of us a lot of time and energy if that were something that we had to deal with less. And this is coming from someone 14 years in who we have it pretty well managed at this point, right? But even so, it's still a reality. It still happens.
Even if everything goes well, the hotel is 5 minutes away from here? Mm-hmm. Hannah and I got up at 5:30 today to get here by 8. And that's when we traveled here. We got up at 4 to make a 7 a.m. flight, and we're 10 minutes away from the airport. And that's our every day. This is how we start every day. And when you add that up 365 times a year, and it doesn't go perfect 365 times a year. There's days where we have to do it again, or you have an involuntary bowel movement. And it's taxing. That adds up. That is how I start every day, is with a little over an hour of AD and Hanna doing that kind of work. It's not glamorous for either one of us. Nope. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think,
sorry.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah.
You brought up a good point. I mean, I think for, I have to get up every day. If I'm going to work and trying to get there by 7 or 8, I have to get up at 4 or 5 just to get Michaela ready, which there's some surgeons here, so that's probably normal for them. But for a pathologist, that's pretty early. And then oftentimes we have to arrange other things, in our day around bladder and bowel. Like, for example, we can't afford to pay someone to come help every day. So, oftentimes I'll come back at lunch just really quick. We don't live that far away from the hospital. Just pop back, help Michaela drain her bag, get lunch, then go back. It's just only a couple things are needed, but arranging for help with those couple things can really cause a lot of hassle. Yeah.
So let me ask a quick next step question there. And again, sorry to tie it to research in that sense, because these are your daily activities. Okay, you have a bowel, bladder programs, what have you. So let's just say that happens between 8 and 12 in the morning. But what if something goes wrong? Minimally, maximally, however you want to describe it, but then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you have some particular research assessment. And then how that endpoint is assessed and analyzed or what have you, what happened to you earlier in the day, I'm thinking can have a major impact on that.
Sure, especially if I'm having a bad mental health day. I'm already at my wit's end. You might not get the best of me, at that point. So that, or even just being exhausted, just not having the wherewithal to speak as, maybe as straightforwardly or as eloquently as I could potentially if I was well rested and had a good day up until that point.
The day-to-day variability is really crazy, and it's a huge challenge for you researchers. I could really, there's probably 10 of me that you could see given on how I'm feeling any day. And to get a consistent baseline even, it can really be challenging. And having the wife as a caregiver is a huge advantage in that aspect, for sure.
The wife is Hanna. But one thing that I think is interesting is, sometimes he goes to PT and the appointment time is set at 8:30 or 9. And I was like, well, I think the earliest you could reasonably go to research, and we live very close to the hospital as well. I was like, well, let's research or PT, whatever it may be, is probably 9:30. And we get up at 7 every morning, and we have it down because it's just me doing it. So I know his body, and so I know how it's going to go kind of when we start. But I think the BOW program, it's difficult on your body. It's uncomfortable. I don't know if you've ever used a suppository or had to in your life, but they're not comfortable. And so he is sweating bullets during this program. He has AD that resonates, maybe 30 minutes to an hour afterwards. And it's not reasonable for him to be at his best, performing his best immediately following that program. So there's just some considerations and also for flying, like I mentioned, it's not easy, it's not comfortable. We could do as much as we can, but a lot of times, again, sweating bullets, uncomfortable. And so if he's flying to go to a research study, and then he flies in, has something early the next day, I don't think he could honestly perform at his best and show you a good baseline just because of all that he's done in the day prior.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
I think too, building on, this is only peripherally related, I guess, but for research programs, I think you mentioned earlier, Michaela, communication as part of it. And I remember one research thing you didn't take part in. I think while we were there, we found out that to participate, we would have to move to that site, which seems like something that should have been mentioned up front. But and that may be necessary for the study, depending on the specifics. But it's a huge deal for someone to move to a completely different city, especially given the specific particularities that you have to live with. And it was almost treated like an afterthought, oh, well, you have a spinal cord injury. What else could possibly be tying you to where you are? It was like it wouldn't be a big deal for us, but it was definitely a deal breaker.
Yeah.
And we had already traveled there at that point.
And that's something we're really passionate about. I think, there are different types of research studies, but the ones where you have to move, this person went through a very traumatic event, is now leaving that community to pursue something to improve, whatever their quality of life is potentially. But we're asked about this a lot because Jerod did move to participate in a study. And then also through social media, he has a social media page, and that's the number one question that he gets asked. And then I talk to individuals who, maybe paralyzed a week prior. I have family members that call, so I talk to a lot of individuals. And I think the thing that we try to say about clinical research is, honestly, it's not about you. It is about the spinal cord injury, and you are an individual, and you are important, but it's research. And so they have a theory to prove, and it's difficult because you have to go into it with the right mindset. Otherwise, I feel like there is a lot of disappointments. And so that's one thing I think that we try to advocate for as well.
I want you to comment, Michaela, but I was just going to say how much, because say what you want to say first, please, but then think about what you feel the proportion is of patients, and I wouldn't include you guys because you definitely get it, of that don't understand that about the role of research versus, you're I don't want to say lured, but that you go in there because of the hope that's being presented to you.
That comes back to informed consent, right? It's not enough to sign a paper and say, you've been informed, great. You have to really impress upon people that this is not going to be the cure that maybe your aunt's cousin messaged you saying, did you see they're doing this new study, right? And you're going to be cured within the year, because I've gotten so many of those messages. And they are well-meaning, but I have to laugh,
Saw it on the Google machine. No,
Yeah. You really have to make sure that people understand, because especially in the early years after the injury, I remember, and I know I'm not the only one, I was desperate. I would have probably done anything. And I think sometimes researchers, whether they know, whether they're fully aware that they're doing it or not, I think sometimes they count on people to be desperate. And that's not okay. You have to impress upon people the reality of what this could mean for you and what it doesn't mean for you as an individual.
And just the nuts and bolts of what research is. We've had to figure it out on our own. I've been in a ton of studies, I've talked to a ton of people, and nobody has ever got a primer when they first get in, hey, this is what research is, this is what we're doing. They'll tell you about the study specifically, but not overall, like, what are we doing here with research? And it's very poorly understood by the community what we're trying to do, and it's what we're trying to do. So we need to know, like, we need to be on the same page. I had a researcher that was talking to me that's like, research, it needs to be like the relationship between an F1 driver and the team. Like, you need to know the car, you need to know, everybody has to have the same goal and be on the same page to have the great communication, to get the endpoints, to get it quicker, to get it cheaper. And if we can just have that open dialogue, we're all gonna get what we want much quicker.
Yeah, I think we want to partner with all of you.
So we want to be valued, yes.
But we have to understand where we're at first, rather than being lured, as you say. And I don't think it's as pernicious.
Nefarious, yeah.
Nefarious
Yeah.
as that.
It's a poor word.
I don't think that's the intent, right? But that's how it can feel after the fact sometimes.
Yeah, I think everybody has their own initiative in mind. And like, I think a lot of time the researcher, they are trying to help us as a whole, not talking to the individual that's right in front of them, you know, so. And like I said earlier, this is just an evolution and a maturation of what we're doing. You know, like, we love the researchers, you guys are great, but it's time for us all to do better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think being straightforward about endpoints too, and also just what a patient can, or a research participant can expect. Like, you know, here is, you know, worst possible and best possible scenario, so they know like where, and you know, what's their experience or expected experience for like the average research participant would be really helpful. It's kind of like the research about, you know, I think like years ago when physicians were afraid of lawsuits or litigation about malpractice, it was like we were afraid to tell patients or like admit, you know, this went wrong or that went wrong. But research shows that the more honest and upfront you are, the less likely you are to, you know, get sued. And in this case, in like the way that carries over to the research setting is if you're upfront with patients or research participants upfront about what are reasonable expectations, they're much more likely to be satisfied as a participant in the study and feel well informed and have an overall better research experience.
Yeah, I mean, the physician yesterday who talked from Kessler talked about like attrition rates, right? It was a wonderful, but I think the important key part of that really resonated with me is you have to build trust with people first. If I can have an honest conversation, understand what's the purpose, why am I here, what can I expect to get out of this, I'm way more likely to stay involved, right? Like just last year, I was considering doing nerve transfer for my arms, and I was really pretty far into the process, like ready to schedule surgery dates, and I felt that I was being pressured by the physician, the surgeon doing the procedure, and I decided, no, I really don't want to do this quite so soon. I need a couple more months to think about it. And he got angry with me. He was frustrated with me, and I found out it was because he had a deadline and he wanted to include me in his data, but if I pushed it off, I wouldn't be able to be included because it would be after the deadline. And I was like, oh, I don't trust you to take care of me as a person. Yeah. If I'm just a data point to you. So I didn't do it. And I was a little, not just a little, I was very disappointed because I was hopeful for the potential. But if I don't trust you as a physician or as a researcher to take care of me.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's hopefully the takeaway here is to understand, you know, more of the day-to-day experience. Maybe you guys already do this, but I was like, why don't researchers try, and colleagues and everybody that works, you know, in research, have you guys tried navigating the world in a wheelchair for a day? I did it for about an hour, and I was, you know, cursing and upset. And did you know that the sidewalks aren't flat? You know, there's like curb cutouts, and then it goes diagonally, and it's hard. But also, I think it's about humanizing the experience, as, you know, very well put. But just understanding, you know, what they are sacrificing. Their bodies are their quality of life is rather good. You know, I think we have a pretty good life, and ultimately, Jerod, and I guess me as a result, we're sacrificing that to be a part of something bigger. And I think, hopefully that resonates, and that's powerful, and that can be respected. And then also, instead of a participant, hopefully be seen as a partner. And then my last thing, but when I was talking about people moving, I think what's important is community. And so you can't just move to a new place, go to a hospital, a very sterile environment, be undressed and be, looked at and prodded, and then be expected just to go back to your hotel or wherever you're staying and wait for the next day. I think that's so unfortunate, and I think what Jerod and I have tried to do is be like the ultimate welcoming committee, because we know that community is so important, and being away from home, it's not comfortable. You kind of like set up your life to work for you in your home environment, and so when you're outside of it, again, there's so many challenges and battles that aren't visible, but are experienced. And so I think that's just something to hopefully take away is these are humans. It's not animals that can go in a cage and wait for the next day to be experimented on. And there is the mental aspect of it as well when you're away from community, away from your day-to-day life, and essentially just sacrificing your body in the name of research.
Communication, logistics, and 1 billion% the human element, which again was going to be, to me, a massive part of PFDD. And Michaela, I was just thinking, because you gave me an example, and I thought it was going to be the one you said about the nerve transfer that you were a part of, but there was one particular study, and I'm curious when you found out in the process, as part of informed consent, that when did you find out that if you were to participate in the study, you would had to stop all other drugs or interventions, whether it was pain meds or what have you?
A week, and it was literally the last day meeting with the primary investigator and her team, talking about the results of all the tests, all the poking and prodding that they had done throughout the week. And it was almost like a side comment, like, oh, and of course you'll have to go off all your oral meds. And I said, wait, I'll have to what? They're like, you have to go off on your own meds. But we find that people don't really have too much of a problem with it. And I'm like, do any of your other participants have sensation? And they were like, no, actually, I don't think so. I'm like, I do. I have an incomplete injury. I feel everything. And if I don't have, if I miss a dose, that helps me manage spasticity and nerve pain, I am miserable. And this is, I was like, I can't believe that I'm just finding this out, right?
And you said that was a week.
That was at the end of the week, yeah. And I was like, this changes everything. I don't even know if I would have come out here if I had known that were part of it, because for me, that's really a deal breaker. For my physical and mental well-being, I mean, if anyone here knows what it's like to cope with chronic pain day in and day out, it wears on you. It is exhausting. And the idea of not having the medication that basically gets me functional, I was like, I can't survive a day without that, much less months or years, Yeah.
I think you've mentioned to me before that there's never a point in any day where you're not feeling any pain.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Why would I go off my pain meds to be part of this study? So I get, so that's very powerful. I appreciate you sharing that. And I guess, Jerod, do you have any examples that fit that category of, you thought something was happening or something you were never told, and then?
I mean, it does just feel like you're in the dark a lot. You show up, and a lot of times, for example, with the research, a lot of times, you can't have caffeine or something in the morning on that. And there's a lot of times where I've got to a study, and they're like, so you didn't have your coffee this morning? I'm like, well, yeah, I have my coffee every morning. And it's like, well, we were supposed to tell you this. And there's just a lot of things that go into your day that I think the researchers end up taking for granted, or this is just business as usual, but it's not for us. And just a little more consideration in keeping us in the conversation goes a long way.
No, very helpful. I wanted to go back a little bit to the actual clinical endpoints. We'll talk more about those later, with the physicians and the different companies or what have you. But again, it's not going for the cure and get up and walking again. But I want to make sure you answer the question in the sense about what's important to you. And I don't mean like how your day went ahead of time and maybe the endpoint of a grip test didn't go as well as the researcher might have planned, but from an improvement standpoint, what's important to you? You gave me one example. I'm not going to take them all away, but about to be able to grip a credit card to put in a slot. But what kind of improvements are meaningful to you that can then potentially translate to clinical endpoints down the road?
Yeah, this is like any improvement is meaningful, and that's something that I want researchers to understand. I guess the FDA and whoever's trying to make these connections, but any improvement can make a big difference. We're dealing with so much. You're talking about constant pain, AD, we got bowel, bladder stuff. Any improvement, it's really tough to quantify what, if you can come up with something that makes a neurological difference, how can you say that that's not impactful or meaningful? That's a proof of concept that something's possible. And while it might not free me from my chair, if it's adding more function, you can't really guess what the long-term implication of that could be. Could that end up being that now I have a little bit more hand strength and I can operate the flip tap on my catheter and now I can urinate by myself? Like, every improvement, if you can see an improvement, that is meaningful. And we'll figure out how to adapt that improvement and show you how it's meaningful, but any improvement, any improvement.
Agreed. And I think that like you just said, we'll figure out how to adapt it. I think every disabled person to a certain extent becomes their own occupational therapist, right? Like, we as a community have become pretty ingenious at figuring out tips and tricks and using what little we have to the
Put
maximum.
loops on everything.
Right? So yeah, any bit, any inch, millimeter of progress. And even I think too, in terms of nerve pain, chronic pain, right? Any improvement in that, not just talking about functional movement, if that can give me energy back, that's huge.
Well, that and the AD, a lot of times I have AD following the BOW program, and I'm lucky where I'm able to work from home. But I try to be productive. But when I have AD, I can't focus. I'm significantly dumber. I'm sitting there trying to do my work, but I can't focus on it because I'm focusing on the AD, whether I want to or not. And so if you could help me out with that, and I could be just a little more productive, a little bit happier, that you can't quantify that. It's huge.
Exactly.
And I think some things, so the biggest fears are he's going to have AD and then, you can't fix that. There's a step, sure, and we can get around that, or we don't have to go into that facility or whatever the case may be. But if he has high blood pressure or low blood pressure, that can ruin a day. Or if he has, he's not able to temperature regulate and he overheats, then we're retiring for the day to go sit in the cold, and it takes hours to regulate. If he's able to. A lot of times it requires a full shower, which means undressing and then dressing again and then trying to rush back out and, live a life. But even today, so these are new pants that Jerod ordered very last minute, and he has a suprapubic catheter, so he has a leg bag right here. But last night after dinner and a couple drinks in, I was sewing the zipper onto his pants so he can access his leg bag. He's able to do that independently, which is amazing. But the fear was, what if he has to go to the bathroom? Then I would have to help him lift up his leg and then, go to the men's bathroom with him, or we could go out to the grass. But those things, I think, that aren't seen make a huge difference in day-to-day life. And it doesn't require being ambulatory at all. It's more about blood pressure, temperature regulation, keeping, muscle spasticity. You saw he had a muscle spasm yesterday, and that could potentially throw him out of a chair, or other individuals really struggle with that, so it's dangerous as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think maybe Dr. Kirschblum yesterday was talking about objective measures, which I totally get and appreciate because I feel like I'm a very objective person also. But he talked about also adding measures that may seem more subjective but are more functional to the research participants as well. You can look at both endpoints, right? So, and sometimes, so if you were doing something to improve bladder spasticity, you could have some very objective measures showing like, muscle tone or muscle activity, but you could add, how many bladder spasms do you experience daily or weekly or something before and after? How many involuntaries did you have during that period of time? And it may not be immediately clear what some of those more functional / subjective measures are, but you could always just interview your patients or research participants at the beginning and say, how does this condition we're targeting affect you on a day-to-day basis? What would be meaningful things for us to measure? And that may help come up with some endpoints like that.
And this is really an absolute recurring theme that came out of even last year's first annual SCI conference with multiple discussions, but even in the discussions with Drs. Failings and Mulcahy, where how are we going to institute quality of life measures in clinical trials that the FDA then will accept as part of moving drugs forward? And that will also include part of our discussion later, especially with you, Dr. Guest, that there's been a lot of failed trials, but with drugs that have activity and how these things are assessed. So I appreciate those comments. And now, I guess, as we look to wrap up, I think I'm going to pose a question to you that I don't necessarily think may have been asked to you. It could be a simple yes, no answer, or hopefully it'll spur a little bit of a discussion. Have you, as patients and caregivers, ever been asked for your feedback as part of research or as part of endpoints or as part of your quality of life? Have you ever been asked personally?
No, and on top of that, I often don't even see the researcher's eyes because all they're doing is reading off of form, when the questions that they are asking me. And there needs to be more of a human element, more of a conversation, not just checking boxes like, do you do this? Yes. Do you do this? Yes. Just look up, look at me, make eye contact. Let's just find a little bit out about each other. And it doesn't, I know we're all under time crunches and we're all trying to get things done, but we're gonna get more out of it, and the juice is gonna be worth the squeeze if you just get to know us a little bit.
I also have not been asked for feedback after the fact. But I think what you're speaking to is a need for a qualitative element here, right?
Right.
Having conversations, picking through themes from those conversations. What does that mean for quality of life? What does that mean for attrition rates? What does that mean for endpoints, right? There's so much value, and I think hard science people often overlook qualitative and see it as maybe a lesser science, but when you're dealing with human beings, qualitative is essential. It really is.
Let me just give one quick example off of what you said, Kyle. It's like the patient's ability to almost take a help me, help you approach. Like if you were to tell them, if you help me deal with my bladder issues better, I could perform so much better in your assessments on the endpoint, something like that. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I think just building on what everyone else has said, those like involuntary bladder or bowel movements can like really take the wind out of your sails if you're like getting ready to go somewhere and you're like already kind of running behind because there's so many extra things you have to do, and then that happens. It can be like really disheartening. So you have to go back to square one, and then you're wondering, should we even continue to do this activity or not?
Cancel?
Yeah. So it could be hugely helpful for people in their day-to-day life.
Yeah, and psychology, oftentimes research, one of the first things you're doing is an ASIA exam, which, includes a rectal exam, which often can cause a bowel movement, and so you're starting off on that foot, and that's the dialogue you start off with, not getting to know them, just making me shit my pants. And,
I know. It does sometimes feel a little bit like, well, take me to dinner first.
Yeah, right, exactly. And actually, one of the joke I always do is I'd be like, no, eye contact. If you're fingering me, we're doing eye contact. I try to make it a little lighthearted because I'm so uncomfortable in there,
I know.
So what I see, I mean, this is extremely helpful feedback. I'm so appreciative of this, and I know the audience is as well, and that we can take this as an important layer of our new discussions for PFDD, because the patient is extremely important in the process. I hope you get to the point now where you and your caregivers can present important feedback to the researchers or the nurses, and just like you said, your daily care that can help you perform better in any way. So thank you so much for all the feedback. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all for listening. Yeah.
Yeah.